Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to this third video on Timothy Morton's book Hyperobjects. In this video we are going to talk about the second part of the book, which is the time of hyperobjects. Now, if you haven't seen the two first videos that I made on this book, the first video was on the introduction of the book, and the second video was on the first part, in which I explained what are hyperobjects. So if you didn't watch them, go check them out. Here I'm going to talk about the second part of the book, the time of hyperobjects. And so the second part of the book also starts with an epigraph, this time by the playwright Sophocles. And the epigraph is taken from his famous play Antigone, the third installment in his Theban plays, the plays about Oedipus. And so Antigone is Oedipus's daughter, and so you know the story. Oedipus was king of Thebes. He learned that he killed his father and he married his mother, and upon this he plucks his eyes out and leaves Thebes. And so Creon, who is Oedipus's father-in-law and who also is his grandfather, he takes over Thebes, and a battle ensues between the two sons of Oedipus, Eteocles and Polynices. I think that's how their names are pronounced. And so the former is with Creon and the latter is against him. And so when Polynices loses, Creon is like, don't bury him, leave him out in the open to rot for daring to oppose the king's will or whatever. And so Antigone is like, no, I have to bury my brother because that's the right thing to do, and no king is above objective morality or. Right. So the quote, the epigraph, is about an ominous atmosphere in post Oedipal Thebes. It's from the second chorus. A chorus is a bunch of singers commenting on the action, and the chorus says, Polata deina kuden anthropou deinoteron pelei. And don't you love it when authors do this, like they give you a quote in another language but they don't translate it? Anyway, so Morton gives a translation of the quote in another book called Dark Ecology for a Logic of Future Coexistence, in which he writes, this is translated by Carson as, many terribly quiet customers exist, but none more terribly quiet than men. And so here the term deina is translated as quietness, but you can think of it as uncanniness. And Morton gives another translation, this time from Heidegger, who translated this passage with, of all the many uncanny beings out there, none is more uncanny than men. And what is meant by uncanniness here? It means a disturbance, and also the disturbing attempt to get rid of that disturbance. Quote, perhaps uncanny doesn't get at how deina suggests disturbing, including the disturbance of the uncanny itself. What is most uncanny about human being is its attempt to rid the world of the uncanny. Or, and this is putting it in its most ecological register, human beings disturbs Earth and its life forms in its desperate and disturbing attempt to get rid itself of disturbance. So basically we disturb, then we want to get rid of the disturbance, which causes further disturbance, etc. And this is what makes human beings so uncanny. And so this is like Oedipus himself, who, because he's smart, he's like Batman, he's like the best detective of the ancient world, but as he tries to solve a murder, a mystery, he finds out that he was the criminal all along, right? And so this discovery is so painful for Oedipus that it leads him to blind himself so that he doesn't see, his word crumble. But of course, that's a further disturbance, which means that you will see your word crumble whether you like it or not. And so just like he tried not to kill his father and knock up his mom, and well, he couldn't escape fate, right? He couldn't escape that fate. So trying to close your eyes to the end of the world, well, that ain't going to happen. You know, his attempt to escape the web of fate was the web of fate. And so plucking out our eyes to avoid seeing the end of the world is also part of seeing the end of the world. So with this in mind, let's now dive into the second part, the time of hyperobjects. And so Morton starts this chapter with the funny scene that is proof that we are living at the time of hyperobjects. If, for example, if you are at the supermarket and as you walk towards your car in the parking lot, a stranger tells you, "Hey, funny weather today." And you reply with a hesitation, "Yes." And so this can seem a little trivial, you know, because I mean it's a trivial everyday conversation. But for Morton, that hesitation is quite revealing. In a time of global warming, a stranger telling you funny weather today can strike you as intriguing. Why? Because you don't know if the person is referring to global warming or if they are straight deniers. You know, I mean, what do you mean by telling me that the weather is funny today? And so he writes, you can no longer have a routine conversation about the weather with a stranger. The presence of global warming looms into the conversation like a shadow, introducing strange gaps, or global warming is spoken, or either way, the reality is strange. And so what makes this strange for Morton is that when in a conversation, everything can relate to global warming, even small talk about the weather. And so it means that there is a loss of foreground and background. What is supposed to be just trivial, for example, what is supposed to be just small talk, comes in like it is something that you cannot disregard. Things we considered trivial or unimportant before, well, not to be given further examination, now cannot be overlooked. And so we can't know what's important and what's trivial anymore. So this is like when you don't know which policy you should focus on. Remember that we talked about it in the last video, when you no longer know what you should favor in terms of policy when it comes to global warming. And so when you cannot distinguish between what is important and what is not important, well, then we can say that both the foreground and the background are confused. And that's what Morton calls the end of the world. Quote, in an age of global warming, there is no background and thus there is no foreground. It is the end of the world since worlds depend on backgrounds and foregrounds. So that's how words end for Morton. It's when something weird happens to our language, when it can no longer distinguish between things in the way that we used to. We can no longer distinguish between which thing is important and which one is trivial. And so faced with this, people can adopt different ways to cope with the end of the world. Either straight denial of global warming, like for example the right-wing people, or you can do what the environmentalists are doing with their apocalyptic scenarios of hypothetical futures. And for Morton, none of them are right, because one says that the end of the world is not going to happen, so that's the denial, and the other is saying that the end of the world will happen, which means that it did not happen yet, but it is coming, and so we have to act now to prevent it. But in reality, as Morton argues, the end of the world has already happened. And so what environmentalists should do, because of course Morton is more sympathetic to them than to deniers. Deniers are a whole other problem, but at least environmentalists are already, riding along with global warming. So what they should do is, quote, drop the concept of nature and world, to cease identifying with them, to swear allegiance to coexistence with non-humans without a world, without some nihilistic Noah's Ark. And so in short, you have to avoid the whole don't look up movie shit, like we're pleading for the politicians to please look at the data, to look at the sky, to see the signs, the flood is coming, hurry. And sometimes it's weird when you think about it, because like most people who deny global warming are right-wing Christian conservatives or maybe Muslims, yet the story of Noah's Ark should make them tick a little bit, you know. I mean, just like Noah's Ark, just like in Noah, you know, I mean, everybody was, you know, denying, you know, that there is a flood, that there's going to be such a thing, and then, you know, it hits. But, you know, when we are actually, you know, talking about real phenomenon and not just, you know, myth, well, all of a sudden, you know, no one seems to care, which is weird and funny. But anyway, so consistency was never an issue for religious people, anyways. So moving on, the point is that the flood has already happened, and we are drowning in it. The shifts in language that happened, the loss of foreground and background, means that there is a shift in the philosophical conceptions of, you know, of substance and of accident, like, you know, the concept of essence and of appearance. And so what happened is that each become the other. Think about the difference between the climate and the weather. The climate is like the substance, while the weather is like the accident. Okay, the weather changes from day to day. Sometimes it is sunny, sometimes it's rainy, sometimes you have clouds in the sky, sometimes, you know, you have snow, sometimes it's cold, etc. Those are accidental. Think of it as you are sitting in a passenger seat. You are in a car on a highway, and you look out the window and you see like a landscape with a huge mountain. And just on the edge of the road, you see, you know, trees and bushes passing by. The speed of the car makes you see rapidly those trees and bushes, and you can hardly get even a glimpse at them. They are passing way too fast for that. But the mountain in the background, however, stays the same. It stays immobile. Despite the car moving at great speed, the movement around the mountain is incredibly slow. So it takes almost, you know, 20 minutes for the mountain to be out of your field of vision, whereas the other objects like trees, fences, houses, gas stations, bushes, etc., disappear as quickly as they appear. And so the mountain here would represent, you know, the substance, and everything else, the trees, for example, are the accident. You know, the mountain, that's like the climate, the trees are like the weather. And so, in other words, they are not necessarily related to each other. I mean, climate and weather, of course, are related, but not in a relation of necessity. And so, the same climate has different weathers, and none of them makes us having to think about the climate. You know, I mean, usually, if today it's sunny and tomorrow it's raining, well, those are not indication that there is something happening between, you know, what we between the rain and, you know, between the weather and the climate, you know. But yeah, like, you know, today is a hot day, and so we just move on. But with global warming, it's something else. Global warming puts all of those on the same ground. You know, the trees and the mountain, they are on the same ground. And now each tree doesn't just disappear as quickly as it appears. Like, each tree on the highway now becomes a mountain of its own. The weather is no longer a tree, but a substantial sign of a bigger cause, a mountain that we don't even see anymore. And so what climate change has done, and this is a quote, is shift the weather from accidental to substantial. So every accident of the weather becomes a potential symptom of a substance, and that is global warming. All of a sudden, this wet stuff falling on my head is a mere feature of some much more sinister phenomena that I can't see with my naked human eyes. And so there's also another side to the shift is that as it makes accidents substantial, it also does the opposite. What we took as substantial, as real, now becomes accidental. Weather again can be like that. I mean, it can be that weather was taken to be the most real thing out there about the climate, where we thought that weather is an indicator for reality, for example, as deniers would do. Like if it gets cold, then the climate is cold, and so we would say checkmate global warming. And so hyperobjects invert that as well. If we thought that weather is substantial, well, now global warming makes it also accidental. So global warming, changes everything. It changes. If we considered weather to be accidental, well, it makes it substantial, and if we thought that the weather is substantial, well, it makes it accidental. Quote, global warming plays a mean trick. It reveals that what we took to be a reliable world was actually just a habitual pattern, a collision between forces such as sunshine and moisture, and humans expecting such things at certain regard intervals and giving them names, such as dog days. We took weather to be real, but in an age of global warming, we see it as an accident, a simulation of something darker, more withdrawn climate. So on the one hand, you think that weather is accidental, but global warming makes it that everything that happens in the weather is related to global warming. And on the other, if you consider that whatever happens in the weather is real, well, global warming turns it to be just a shadow, just a simulation of something darker and withdrawn that we don't see. So in both cases, you won't going to see global warming because of this effect, that it transforms the accidental into substance and the substance into accident. And so to quote Morton referring to Harman, he says, "World is always presence at hand, a mere caricature of some real object." And so our world turns out to be a broken world. Presence at hand is a Heideggerian term which he uses to talk about when you realize that something is broken, and so it is just there. It is present, it has a presence, but that's all that it does. It just sits there, and all you can do is just theorize about it. And so our world is in a state like that. It is broken. What we took to be trivial turns out to be important, and what we took to be important turns out to be trivial. And so the tools that we are using so far, well, they're not good at all, because, quote, "The tools that humanists have at their disposal for talking about the ecological emergency are now revealed by global warming itself to be as useless as the proverbial chocolate teapot. It is rather like the idea of using an antique or better antiqued Christmas ornament as a weapon." So Morton urges the necessity to come up with another construction to deal with global warming, a new and more suitable aesthetic construction. Quote, "A profound political act would be to choose another aesthetic construct, one that doesn't require smoothness and distance and coolness. World is by no means doing what it should to help ecological criticism." And so world, according to Morton, is too ingrained in agricultural thinking, and it is agriculture that is setting the stage for what we call a world. Agriculture is an example of how world creates ideology. And ideology, as Morton says, is not just in your head. It's in the shape of a Coke bottle. It's in the way some things appear natural, rolling hills and greenery, as if the Industrial Revolution had never occurred, and moreover, as if agriculture was nature. And so ideology naturalizes human organization like agriculture. Like you have agriculture, and ideology wants you to think that agriculture is nature, when in reality it is just a human organization, a political and social form to organize political life. And so ecological thought can be looked at like the landscapes in The Lord of the Rings, Morton explains that in Tolkien's universe, that like in that universe, in that world, you see plains and prairies, but you never see how they are made. Right? It's like people are living there, and the people living there, the hobbits, just stumbled on the place and just live there. You know, like they just arrived, or they were created there, and you know, I mean, they found the land in that state already. We don't know what they grow on those lands, to whom they sell it, how they plow, what they do in there, except, you know, getting high and getting drunk. It seems as if their world is just natural. And yet, to have such landscapes, that requires a lot of work, a lot of plowing. Such landscapes are not natural, but ideology makes it seem that way. It naturalized things that are socially constructed, things that have a history, instead of a natural process that was bound to become what we see. And so agriculture is not natural, and the world it creates is not either. But along this naturalization, this naturalizing, comes also an ethics to sustain it. Another way to make something natural, world is going to provide some morality attached to it. So the agricultural world becomes, comes along with a few ethical imperatives, such as it is wrong to intervene on someone else's land or someone else's property. The land belongs to someone. So if you try to deconstruct the agricultural world, then that means that you are claiming to do something on the land that is not yours. And so private property is often used as a rhetorical weapon to justify the agricultural mode of production. The agricultural world is justified on the basis of morality. So not only agriculture is natural, but it is also morally wrong to go against it. But as Morton points, that these concepts of world and worldling mean that we're losing our grasp on reality, and we are desperately attempting to hold our grip. It is as if humans are losing both their world and their idea of world, including the idea that they ever had a world at the same time, at one and the same time. The world, as the significant totality of what is the case, is strictly unimaginable, and for a good reason it doesn't exist. And so his critique of capitalism is also based on this idea of non-existence. Like we said in our previous video, ecology should be without nature and should be without matter. And so Morton here asserts that agricultural world needs to rely on notions of nature and of matter, just like capitalism also rely on those notions, because those are their raw material. They need to have raw materials, and so they have to say that there are raw materials, and those are going to be nature and matter. Quote, it doesn't really care, so it is capitalism. It doesn't really care what comes through the factory door, just as long as it generates more capital. Do we want to sustain a world based on a philosophy of grey goo? Nature is the featureless reminder at either end of the process of production. Either it's exploitable stuff or value-added stuff. Whatever it is, it's basically featureless, abstract, grey. And so nature is like the new myth for capitalism. After it had dispensed with the superstitions of the Middle Ages, capitalism had to create its own new world, its own myth, and make aesthetic and make it, make this myth very aesthetic and as appealing as the other myths that were used before it. But by making it, sound as if this time it's not a myth, but it is something real. Okay, so I am bringing a new myth to replace those that existed before, but my new myth has to be better in the sense that this time what I'm bringing is not a myth. It is as appealing as myths, but this time it is something real. And so, whereas the myths about some divine hierarchies or divine chain of beings was thwarted by capitalism, capitalism brought its own myth as well. Capitalism, quote, substituted a giant myth of its own, nature. Nature is precisely the lump that exists prior to the capitalist labor process. And so the problem with this myth of nature is that it rejects the presence of hyperobjects. Like, you cannot have both. You cannot have the myth of nature and at the same time, have hyperobjects. It comes with a belief of some, infinite great beyond. I mean, as we said, hyperobjects, they're not infinite, whereas nature is. Okay, so you cannot have both at the same time. So the myth of nature comes with the belief that there is some infinite great beyond, since capitalism is predicated on the assumption that there can be such a thing as unlimited growth. It also must postulate that its raw materials are also unlimited, also infinite. And so nature becomes infinite. It becomes a great beyond that will always exist. So nature and matter become some sort of unconditional loving mothers, and like the unconditional loving people, they get all the shit from their abusive partners. Nature becomes just an instrument of infinite growth, of stockpiling. And since it is infinite, well, what can some spilt oil do to infinity? Ecological disasters through chemical dumping, for example, aren't much of a problem anymore. Since nature is always going to be here, and so like, ecological disasters become a small price, a small inconvenience compared to the infinite growth that lies in front of us. And remember, nature, the great beyond, this godlike figure, is omniscient, omnipotent, and also benevolent. And so we always believe that nature, because of all of these features, will always take care of these things for us. He quotes, to quote Morton, "The essence of reality is capital and nature. Both exist in an ethereal beyond. Over here, where we live, is an oil spill, but don't worry, the beyond will take care of it." But then, the constant dumping and hoping that nature will take care of it come back to bite us in the tush. Quote, 200 years of idealism, 200 years of seeing humans as the center of existence, and now the objects take revenge, terrifying, huge, ancient, long-lived, threateningly minute, invading every cell in your body. When we flush the toilet, we imagine that the U-bend takes the waste away into some ontological alien realm. But whatever you throw in the toilet, well, it goes to the ocean in which you swim. And similarly, chemical wastes like CO2 emissions, the plastic bags and bottles piling up, and you don't know what to do with them, well, at one point, the time in which they are going to take over will, of course, come. And it has already. So, hence, it is important to see that these concepts of matter and of nature don't exist, cannot exist, shouldn't exist. And so, again, go watch the previous video in which I explained that, matter isn't the same thing as physicality, because, when you say that matter doesn't exist, doesn't mean that we deny the physical world. But anyways, denying matter doesn't mean that you are an idealist. Anyways, go check the other video. So, for Morton, since that world of agriculture does not exist, we have to orient ourselves towards one that exists, one in which hyperobjects are included. So he knows that it's not easy, but it is what we have to do because hyperobjects exist and they are already transforming us. We have we went through the exit of, being the center of world long ago. But one can say, well, if ideology is no longer about nature or about the world, then what is it about? If ecology, sorry, not ideology, if ecology is no longer about nature, well, then what is it about? After all, ecology, doesn't it mean the study of the home, the oikos in Greek? And Morton points to this in his book. He says that in reality, in a reality without a home, without world, what this study calls objects are what constitute reality. And so ecology becomes the study of objects, okay? And how and they coexist with each other. This will require that we have a deeper understanding of what it means to be an object, since now we are going to be coexisting with them. He says, objects are unique. Objects cannot be reduced to smaller objects or dissolved upward into larger ones. Objects are withdrawn from one another and from themselves. Objects like TARDIS-like, larger on the inside than they are on the outside. Objects are uncanny. Objects compose an untotalizable, non-whole set that defies holism and reductionism. So whatever worldview we need, it's going to be one in which holism and reductionism are impossible. That you can say that things are part of a whole. You cannot reduce the whole to its parts, and so that way even what would be considered a whole in the agricultural world, a whole, so our world would be equal to any other object, whether as its part or not. And so in short, there is no top object that gives all object value and meaning, and no bottom object to which they can be reduced. So there cannot be houses in this sense, or at least we're going to have to rethink radically the meaning of a house. And so any object for Morton can be a house for another object. Everything is an everything, as we said in the last video. Morton quotes from a poem for kids about houses, saying that the way this poem talks about houses can be the best thing to read in ecology. The poem is A House is a House for Me by Marianne Hoberman, and the poem reads, cartons are houses for crackers, castles are houses for kings. The more I think about houses, the more things are houses for things. And so Morton comments on this as home, oikos, is unstable. Who knows where it stops and starts? The poem presents us with an increasingly dizzying array of objects. They can act as homes for each other, for other objects, and of course in turn these homes can find themselves on the inside of other homes. Home is purely sensual. A home is the way an object experiences the entity in whose interior it finds itself. And so experiencing everything like a home is an effect of hyperobjects, since hyperobject can be like the home of homes. To quote, the time of hyperobject is the time during which we discover ourselves on the inside of some big objects, bigger than us, that is, Earth, global warming, evolution, etc. And so houses, like hyperobjects, are sensual objects. In object-oriented ontology, a sensual object is an appearance for another object. The table for my pencil is a sensual object. The table for my eyes is a sensual object. The table for my dinner is a sensual object. Sensual objects are wonderfully, disturbingly entangled with one another. That is where causality happens, not in some mechanical basement. This is where the magical illusion of appearance happens. A mirror's house for reflections. Yes, the mesh, the interrelatedness of everything is a sensual object. Strange strangers are the real objects. Some very important entities that environmentalism think of as real, such as nature, are also sensual objects. They appear as what they are for an experiencer or user or apprehender. They are manifestations of what Harman calls the as structure, they are as structured, even though they appear to be some deep background to human events. And so in short, sensual objects, which basically is an object that attunes to what is inside it, like music. We also talked about that in the first video of the series. What is innovative with sensual objects is that they deconstruct nature, because the problem with nature is that not everything can be a house, and not every house can be a house for everything, you know? Like some combinations are natural. It is natural. It's like nature favors the idea of home as a property just for me, you know, and it cannot be for you. You know, you cannot have a property because I already have that property. You're gonna have to go look for it elsewhere. You know, my property, my house cannot be your house too, you know. And so why? Well, because nature wanted it to be that way. Because nature knows where everything fits, and this is not where nature assigned you to fit. And so Morton gives a metaphor with bread and jam. He says the confusion of sensual and real in the terms of a house is a house for me is like thinking that bread really is a house for jam and jam alone, rather than simply an idea that occurs to me and perhaps to the jam when it finds itself slaughtered in there. Marmalade wants in on the bread. Too bad, marmalade is an artificial, unnatural parasite. Peanut butter, alien, illegal alien. Only jam is natural, such that bread is only made for jam. And so you can see the problem with nature, is that it excludes other things that can belong on the bread, like marmalade. And so hyperobjects would oblige you to consider other objects as belonging to the homes, you know, and also the homes would also be objects that belongs to bigger homes, etc., etc. And so human beings have often justified their xenophobia, for example, on the basis that they're naturally better than others, for example, or through self-interest, an idea that the capitalist and agricultural mindset has naturalized, right? And so the capitalist myth about nature states that the law of human nature is that of self-interest, and that you can never make human beings act in inclusive or altruistic ways, for that matter, if it is against their self-interests. But Morton argues otherwise. The human beings are social above rational or self-interested human beings, and they can choose options that favor the group instead of their own self-interests. And so Morton gives the thought experiment, the prisoner's dilemma. And so basically, for those who don't know it, well, imagine you rob the bank, and you have, you know, an accomplice with you, and you both get arrested by the cops. And so you are separated, and you cannot communicate with each other, and each one of you gets interrogated. And the cops give you the same deal. Okay, if you snitch on your partner, you get to go scot-free, but they get 3 years in jail. If they snitch on you, well, they get to go and you get 3 years. If you both snitch on each other, you both get 3 years. But if none of you snitch on the other, you just get a minor sentence, you just get 1 year in jail, each one of you. And so what do you do in that situation? Well, for Morton, the best thing to do is, and it is also the most rational thing to do, is that both prisoners don't snitch and get each a smaller sentence. And so this example is taken from another philosopher's book, Derek Parfit. The book is called Persons and Reasons, in which Parfit tells us that in case of global warming, it's the same thing as the prisoner's dilemma. We are the prisoners right now who has to, you know, collaborate with someone they can talk to or speak to, either in time or in space. You know, like in space, that would be when two countries would agree to change their economic policies and structures, but what if the other country doesn't do it? What if only one of the two countries follows? And so, you can think of the USA and China, for example, both saying that global warming is a hoax invented by the other party to destroy their economic competitivity. That's what Trump said about global warming, that it was invented by the Chinese to force us to force the Americans into making deals that would hurt their economic interests. And so that countries like China needs to rethink their economic policies because of its impact on the environment is also, it is something important, both China and the United States, but what gives me the guarantee that it's not just a ruse for my competitors to beat me at the world market, when the Chinese have to be sanctioned for, endangering the environment, they would say that that's just a ruse to prevent me from industrializing my country and, entering into the world market, so that the world market would still be dominated by the US, for example. And so we can even bring this to a more local level. Why should I consume less, for example, when my neighbor doesn't reduce his consumption? And if we add to this class struggle, where, like we know, the rich won't give up on their wealth. So in that case, if you tell me to consume less, it seems like I'm the one who has to reduce their standards of living that I earned through sacrifice and hard work, so that I get eliminated from the competition, And so I'm going to say, hell no, in no way I'm going to reduce my consumption or what I am producing, because if I do it and my competitor doesn't, well, I'm out of the game. And so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go bankrupt. And this also applies in time, where I am also responsible for an unknown person to whom I am not at all related, a person that lives thousands of years ahead of me, and I have to trust that my choice of, not snitch now, let's say, will have the consequence that is desired, that the other person in the future isn't going to throw it away, right? Is not going to throw away my sacrifice. But, in both cases, you don't know what the other is going to do, and so you are in that dilemma. You are like in the prisoner's dilemma. But this dilemma for Morton shows precisely the limits of capitalist thought and of self-interest. He writes, default capitalist economics is rational choice theory, which is deeply a self-interest theory. Yet the prisoner's dilemma indicates we're profoundly social beings, even self-interest accounts for the other somehow. The prisoner's dilemma encourages one to think about how change begins. One thinks of the other, one brings the other into decisions that are supposedly about one's self-interest. To this extent, the prisoner's dilemma is formally collectivist, even though it lacks a positive collectivist or socialist content. Hence, now it's not about situations of what if humans choose self-interest, but the only rational choice is to choose not to snitch. That's the only available option. And the myth of self-interest is just an illusionary wall that stands in front of us, making us doubt that we are social and collectivist, and so making us unable to trust others. Trust them to the point of letting them in our homes, which are not really ours, but you get the idea. And so it is necessary to let go of what constitutes a self. You have to let go of the notion of a sense of self, let's say. Hyperobjects are the reality of our world, and that world works without selves, as in self-interest. Yes, it has a weakness, as Morton points out. The weakness of this ethical position is determined by the radical withdrawal of the future being. I can never fully experience, explain, or otherwise account for her, him, or it. We may not know what is going to happen in the future, but what we know is that whatever we're doing so far is not working. So if we accepted the premises of the future of the unknown possibilities in the rift, remember also that's a notion that I explained in the last video, then we have no reason to accept them when it comes to human beings. We have no reason we have no reason not to accept them when it comes to human beings. We have no reason not to take the leap of faith regarding hospitality, for example, to let homes be homes to whomever they attune to what Derrida calls l'arrivant, the coming stranger, or the future. To quote from Morton, not the future we can predict and manage, but an unknowable future, a genuinely future. In the present moment, we must develop an ethics that addresses what Derrida calls l'arrivant, the absolutely unexpected and unexpectable arrival, or what I call the strange stranger, the stranger whose strangeness is forever strange. It cannot be tamed or rationalized away. What we need is an ethics of the other, an ethics based on the proximity of the stranger. And so this is a call for sincerity. As we've also seen, we've talked about sincerity a little bit before, but it is also a call for intimacy. That's the kind of world that we will hopefully have if we get rid of the world. As he says, what remains without a world is intimacy. Without the world, we get a world of intimacy. And intimacy isn't much something that you can manage as much as something to experience. It is a sensual object as well. Therefore, it is no longer a matter of what to do, as in what policies should we choose over others. If we think that way, then we're not thinking in terms of hyperobjects. He says, the ethical and political choices become much clearer and less divisive if we begin to think of pollution and global warming and radiation as effects of hyperobjects rather than as flows or processes that can be managed. These flows are often eventually shunned into some less powerful group's backyard. We call this ecological oppression. It's like we said, someone else's problem. It's always the most vulnerable group that has to deal with the dumping in their backyard, right? Like the Native American tribes must deal with the radioactive waste. The African American family must deal with the toxic chemical runoff. The Nigerian village must deal with the oil slick. And so, of course, these ethical models must not apply to humans alone. Like, it's not just a metaphor for xenophobia, object-oriented ontology is primarily about objects. Humans are objects too. So it is a radical political theory regarding democracy. For Morton, a democratic state is also one that includes non-humans. Quote, by embracing the hyperobjects that loom into our social space and dropping nature, world and so on, we have a chance to create more democratic modes of coexistence between humans and with non-humans. And this is to suggest that we already are in a time of coexistence with non-human objects, and that thinking we can keep the distinction sharp and neat is just wrong. That's just something that we do in vain. Plastic bags and soda cans are already part of our social and political spaces, and this applies all the way down to the nuclear, to the radioactive. Nuclear materials are already occupying social space. It is intrinsically scary. It is an intrinsically scary thought, but wishing not to think it is but wishing not to think it is just postponing the inevitable. And so admitting that non-human objects are not going anywhere is also a way to deconstruct the notion of world that we have. In world, we are brought to imagine that there are some limits to that world, out of which we can throw those undesirable objects, but such limits don't exist. You know, our world doesn't exist, and so we're just likely to poison the water of someone. You know, you cannot just, you know, think that your world stops somewhere and you can you can dump your waste outside of that limit, because you know that the place that you are going to dump your waste into is going to be the water of someone else. So there is no outside, there is no container, if you want, there is no container in which everything, all life form and non-life forms, as well as their relationships, are not inside a container. Quote, we won't find an umbrella that unifies them, such as word, environment, ecosystem, or even astonishingly earth. What we discover instead is an open-ended mesh that consists of grass, iron, popsicles, sunlight, the galaxy Sagittarius, and mushroom spores. Earth is one object coexisting with mice, sugar, elephant, and Turin. And so likewise, we cannot wish to leave global warming. There is no outside of hyperobjects once we're trapped in them. They glue us to our phenomenological experience. He says, inside the belly of the whale, that is global warming, it is oppressive and hot, and there is no away anymore. And in that oppressive belly, we enter what he called the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley is a term used in CGI when you make something that is so familiar to human beings that you are at the threshold of losing possible distinction between the image and reality. He says in the uncanny valley, beings are strangely familiar and familiarly strange. However, for Morton, this uncanny valley isn't a problem if you are at home with hyperobjects and with non-human life forms or non-life forms. Quote, the uncanny valley, in other words, is only a valley if you already have some quite racist assumptions about life forms. With ecological awareness, there is no healthy person on the other side of the valley. Everything in our world starts to slip into the uncanny valley, whose sides are infinite and slick. So, to put it simply, we need to come up with ways to be at ease or at home with the uncanny valley. That way, that we can have instead is a future of coexistence with hyperobjects. And Morton thinks that we can have a glimpse at it through art and architecture. Quote, art and architecture in the time of hyperobjects must automatically directly include hyperobjects even when they try to ignore them. So literally we need to make buildings and organize space in such a way that the presence of hyperobjects is brought to the fore, instead of holding on to a worldview in which hyperobjects don't exist, that we can, just get rid of the waste by dumping it somewhere. It is like we have to construct societies based on, it's like when you discover that the Earth is not at the center of the universe, and so you need to construct societies that would reflect, that we are now aware of heliocentrism, and societies that are based on heliocentrism instead of holding on to geocentric models. It's just a metaphor to make this clearer, which I hope I made it clear. Relativity, therefore, must become our day-to-day theory instead of Newtonian physics, like we said also in the previous video. And well, architects and artists can get us there, creating an architecture based on what he calls dark ecology. Quote, it would make more sense to design in a dark ecological way, admitting our coexistence with toxic substances we have created and exploited. And so the book offers many examples of such art and architecture. I mentioned some of them, but the point is art can achieve the situation of coexistence instead of looking for ways to get out of that situation. Again, there is no way out. Quote, there is no exit from this situation, thus the time of hyperobjects is a time of sincerity, a time in which it is impossible to achieve a final distance toward the world. But for this very reason, it is also a time of irony. We realize that non-human entities exist and are incomparably more vast and powerful than we are, and that our reality is caught in them. And so art is now supposed to capture that sincerity and irony in order to make us more at ease with the reality that we have to share with hyper-objects. But what do we mean by sincerity and irony here? Well, this is where we get to the second chapter of the book, and it is about hypocrisies. We need to understand that the age of hyperobjects is also the age of hypocrisies. And so Morton calls this starts with chapter with a well-known thought experiment in ethics called "Should you save the child?" Imagine like you're walking down the streets and you see a kid playing in the middle of the road, and there is a truck that is rushing towards him. Well, what do? Well, the intuitive thing is we all jump to pull the kid out of the way. There's almost no hesitation there, right? But what if it happens again? Like you save the kid, but then the same kid plays again in the middle of the road and a truck is coming again. And the kid didn't seem to learn his lesson. Now the hesitation settles in. Now you start thinking if it is worth to save the kid who obviously didn't understand the risk he's in and the risk he'll make me take if I try to save him. And so as I contemplate the cons and pros, the kid dies. All right, and then it happens again with another kid, and as this keeps happening, you think about it more and more often, and so you start asking yourself, well, is there any reason for me to do something about it? But then, just like you can't give any reason for why you love someone, because any reason you give can essentially be countered to prove that's not really love, well, the same is applicable to care. You know, he says, you know that all the reasons in the world are not enough of a reason to love. In case you ever felt something uncanny about love because you can't explain it away, like for example, why do you love X? Well, love always have an uncanny feeling. You know, you can't really explain it. People often talk about love as something that they cannot control, that they cannot explain, and we know from many examples of abusive relationships that can be very scary. Okay, because it's very risky. Love can have such an enchanting effect on you that you end up doing things or accepting situations without knowing why. And so when you cannot explain something, it gets an uncanny feeling to it. And this uncanny feeling is at the heart of hyperobjects and also of hypocrisies. If we apply this to global warming, it translates as well, we don't have any reasons to prove or to care about someone. We also don't have any reasons to care about global warming. And so having no reasons to care, it doesn't mean that we're bad people, but that we simply cannot think of any good reasons to give a shit. It's not that we are not willing to give a shit. It's not like we don't care. We actually do. The problem is we cannot explain why we care, or we cannot explain the care itself. You know, it's not that we don't want to save the kid. We want to save the kid. We just believe that in order to do so, there has to be a good reason for me to do that. Otherwise, saving the kid is irrational, and irrationality cannot be good, right? So it's like, you know, you have the urge of saving the kid, but as long as you cannot explain why you need to save the kid, why you're going to save the kid, you cannot act on that drive or on that feeling. So in other words, we're facing what in philosophy we call a wicked problem, which means a problem that one can understand perfectly, but for which there is no rational solution. So this is very different from being a psychopath, right? Like we do feel empathy, and we do care about the kid who is about to get hit by the truck, and we understand perfectly the problem, like the kid is about to get crushed. The issue is that we find no rational link between that problem and the care, you know? And without that link, whenever I care or not, nothing can compel me to act, right? So that link would be, let's say, the rational solution. But that rational solution simply doesn't exist. And that's the situation we're facing with global warming. Or actually, it's way worse with global warming, because it's not just a wicked problem, it's a super wicked problem, as Morton calls it. Global warming has now been labeled a super wicked problem for which time is running out, for which there is no central authority, where those seeking the solution to it are also creating it, and where policies discount the future irrationally. So in the case of global warming, there is an asymmetry between the urgency and the passion and the horror that we feel when confronted with hyperobjects that could profoundly alter life on Earth, and the sense of cognitive weirdness and irony that we feel for exactly the same reason. We understand the gravity of the situation, but for the same reason, we cannot seem to know what to do about it, or even if we should do anything about it. And so in the case of global warming, it seems that, quote, every position is wrong. Every position, including and especially the know-it-all cynicism that thinks that it knows better than anyone else. And so this asymmetry for Morton is simply the proof of our limited cognitive capacities in capitalist modes of thinking. The capitalist ideology that tells us that the world is in a certain way, the one that tells us, remember, nature and matter and self-interest, those limit our capacities for thinking because it narrows the universe to just that worldview. So in other words, imagine you have like some sort of superpowers, you have other, faculties or capabilities, whatever, but you live in a world that tells you that you cannot use them because our world does not recognize them, does not need them. But what's beyond that world, and it is affecting, that world, requires you to use those superpowers. It's like there is a meteor coming down on you, coming to crush the earth, and you have the powers of Superman, but there is a worldview around you that doesn't believe in the in the rock falling from space, and so as long as you're trapped in a small world of ideology, which obviously is crumbling because of what's beyond it. What's beyond it is crushing it. The hyperobject is crushing it. You cannot deal with that beyond. And so beyond here is used metaphorically, like the hyperobjects are only a problem because our rational solutions are not fit for them. They fit within the narrow capitalist worldview, all right? Like we're stuck because we want to find three-dimensional solutions to four-dimensional problems. Quote, hyperobjects compel us to adapt attitudes for which humans are not well prepared in an age of advanced consumer capitalism. So we need to think differently about this. We can't find solutions in the present or from the past, because the problem of global warming is a future problem. Quote, hyperobjects are messages in bottles from the future. They do not quite exist in a present, since they scoop the standard reference point from the idea of present time. In order to cope with them, we require theories of ethics that are based on scales and scopes that hugely transcend normative self-interest theories, even when we modify self-interest by many orders of magnitude to include several generations down the line of all existing life forms on Earth. So we are going to need the ethics mentioned earlier, the kind of selfless ethics This can scare some people who sees it closer to totalitarian ideologies that would crush the individualities of people, or to sacrificial religions that are willing to sacrifice the identities of people for some abstract greater good, for example, which often turns out to be the greater good for just a small minority of rich and powerful people. Like it's always the powerless who have to abandon their identities while the powerful maintain theirs. It's another way to make the masses behave and sacrifice themselves for the powerful minority. And so this is a legit criticism, and we'll talk about it in some other videos about maybe about a philosophy called long-termism. Morton's hyperobjects and object-oriented ontology are a bit close to it. You can watch these videos right here for a long critique of long-termism, and also called The Religion of the Rich, but let's move on. So the point of Morton is that the philosophy of hyperobjects forces us, whether we like it or not, towards radical intimacy. And the powerful aren't very known for wanting intimacy. On the contrary, they tend to lead lifestyles completely devoid of intimacy and closeness, even towards their own relatives or family members. And they also not know what they are also not known for being good at dealing with emotions and feelings, and with morality, let's say. As Morton's ethics, as for Morton ethics, he says the no-self view is not faceless, dehumanized abstraction, but a radical encounter with intimacy. What best explains ecological awareness is a sense of intimacy, not a sense of belonging to something bigger, a sense of being close, even too close to other life forms, of having them under one's skin. Hyperobjects forces us into intimacy with our own death because they are toxic, and with others because everyone is affected by them, and with the future because they are massively distributed in time. So these ethics that are grounded in the future are not abstract or far-fetched. They are also about the present, and they are especially about closeness. And again, they are about intimacy, a radical intimacy that involves what we call endosymbiosis. The fact that life forms do not simply live alongside us, they are within us, so much so that on many levels the host-parasite distinction collapses. That is how close the other is. Ecology is about intimacy. And so this intimacy with non-human and non-life forms, with objects, reveals something about our relation with objects. We often think that objects are made as tools for our needs and interests, whereas in object-oriented ontology, the relation is kind of reversed. Humans are the tools for objects. And so, drawing on other philosophers like Alfonso Lingi, I'm not sure if the pronunciation of his name, it's from a book called The Imperative. Morton writes, non-humans, argues Lingis, tell us how to dispose ourselves toward them. A hammer wants to be held in a certain way. A forest path issues directives to my body to walk at a particular pace, listen for animals, avoid obstacles. A cigarette butt demands that I put it out. These directives grip me already before I can reflect rationally or not on the right course of action. So these directives, these demands that the objects are creating are happening in what he calls a zone. It is like a radius in which once you enter that zone, the objects pull you closer to them with their directives. It's like you entered into the territory of objects, and now the objects are pulling you in some way. When you walk in a room in which there is a nail and a hammer, you walked into a zone in which objects are telling you how they want to be held, how they want to be used. So in this sense, the agency of the human subject is thwarted, since it is not us, it's not the human who make the decision to use this or that object, but it is the objects themselves. And so these zones in which we find ourselves, rather than we make the decision to be in those zones, they are kind of spontaneous, they are unpredictable, they are rebellious, and they are undetermined, kind of like the particles in quantum mechanics. You know, is it a wave or a particle? It's up for it to decide what's best for it to be. So these zones are like the TAZ, TAZ, the temporary autonomous zones, which is a concept formed by the anarchist philosopher Hakim Bey. Well, that's not his real name, but we will talk about Hakim Bey because I'm planning on doing a review of a book about anarchy, and the book discusses Bey's philosophy. So we will talk about him. Just for now, you know, basically his TAZ are like moments in which individuals break from oppressive political power, not by theorizing, but by acting in a spontaneous way. The point is, objects create zones that rupture with the dominant ideology of the subject-oriented relation. All right, so this is how Morton uses Bey's concept. And so, to quote Morton, the birth of a fresh object is a political interruption, a revolution that changes all the other objects, no matter how slightly. A zone is not studiously decided on by committee before it goes into action. Irreducibly, it is already happening. We find ourselves in it all of a sudden in the late afternoon as the shadows lengthen around a city square, giving rise to an uncanny sensation of having been here before. Now, these zones that break the ideology, let's say, that forces the subject to coexist with the objects, they reveal what Morton calls hypocrisies. And so hypocrisy is basically when someone tries to bring a justification for something they cannot justify, while knowing that they cannot justify it. You ever got you ever got caught saying something stupid, and then you just persist in trying to prove that it's not stupid, and going through twists and turns that make the stupidity just even more apparent, but you keep trying to cover it up, adding even more and more ad hoc hypotheses, and everyone knows how dumb you sound now. Rolling with all of this, a massive pack of bullshit, and you try so hard to maintain that you are not stupid, trying so hard to convince that you are not being an idiot. Well, that's what we're talking about. That's hypocrisy. You try to justify something like, for example, God made the universe, or gender is binary, capitalism is natural, global warming is a hoax, the sound of freedom is right-wing propaganda, the gender ideology is brainwashing the kids, I love this person because of X, I save the kid because of Y. So all of those crumble once hyperobjects enter the scene. They just make you look like a hypocrite, and sometimes a hypocritical idiot. Quote, the simplest cigarette butt or a child running into the street reduces every ethical or political stance to the status of hypocrisy. It is the hyperobject that forces us to sense this hypocrisy most exquisitely. Hyperobjects are simply so large and so long-lasting that the zones that cascade from them are rich and intense enough for us to become aware of them, and to become aware of the irreducible gap between zone and object, which Kant calls the gap between the phenomenon and the thing. So Immanuel Kant was therefore right when he said that the gap between the noumena, the thing in itself, and the phenomena, the thing for itself, how things appear, cannot be bridged. What he meant was that no amount of rational discourse can justify how you perceive the phenomena. And so this is what hyperobject compel us to realize, that we cannot justify whatever it is that we do. The only justification is that the zone compels us to do it. Like I didn't put the cigarette butt out because I thought that it is wrong to start a forest fire, but because the cigarette gripped me in its zone and demanded that it gets put out. And so indeed, if I need a reason, a rational reason to put out the cigarette, then I probably won't put it out. Of course, I can say, well, as I was putting the cigarette down, I was thinking about the forest fire, but, just because you had that thought, it doesn't mean that is the cause of you putting putting out the cigarette. And so, as Morton writes, it is simply impossible to come up with the right reason for why I put the cigarette out in the sequoia forest. Indeed, if I try to generate a reason, I find myself watching the cigarette burn the undergrowth. I have already made a decision not to put out the cigarette. The zone has already grasped me in its beams. And so if this is correct, then any concept of a world comes off as hypocritical, because these zones that come from objects are literally world-ending. I'm talking of a world at a time where there is no world. All right? When people try to justify their worldview in times of hyperobjects, in time in which there is no world, well, that's hypocritical. So zones are world-ending in the sense that they reveal what objects are truly doing to us. They lift the world, the veil that we put on objects to make them fit within our own needs, to hide away their uncanniness, the fact that we're not special compared to other objects. And so in this sense, objects are apocalyptic, and hyperobjects are radically apocalyptic. They lift the veil. That's the meaning of the apocalypse. Like there's a veil that has been lifted and now you see things as they are. And so you can maybe fool a table with the world, but a hyperobject always sees through your world. Global warming makes all attempt at denying it or solving it through policies obsolete and hypocritical, and make you see our world as what it really is. He says hyperobjects are genuinely apocalyptic in the sense that they lift the veil of prejudice. So you have all these prejudices that you throw on the objects themselves so that you can control their uncanniness, but hyperobjects, well, they lift up those prejudices. And so denying the existence of global warming or admitting its existence as presence are both wrong, because both are predicted on nature and, the present. But we've seen that neither of those is a thing. So the presence of hyperobject is different from what we usually think of when we say that something is real. Rather, the reality of hyperobject is one that is different from the kind of reality we get at through rational discourse, or the kind of reality we get when we are awake. It is a reality that exists as unreal, like a dream, or in this case, a nightmare. Hyperobjects are real as the unconscious. And so global warming deniers are basically saying that the unconscious doesn't exist when they deny global warming. And environmentalists, on the other hand, they say that the unconscious is knowable. So being inside hyperobjects compels us, however, to look at things differently. To look at reality with the element of unreality. The part that is constantly withdrawn from us. Quote, the feeling of being inside a hyperobject contains a certain element of unreality, yet this is a symptom of its reality. So trying to explain the unreality of hyperobjects rationally runs the risk of denying the hyperobject's own existence. Hyperobjects are experienced through their weirdness. They make things weird, but seeing weird things doesn't mean that there's something wrong in our thinking or that we are missing some pieces of the puzzle. Actually, that's how things are. the weirdness of the word is perfectly normal when we think of hyperobjects. It's the hyperobject's shadow, actually. You know, the weirdness is telling us, the weirdness is pointing at the hyperobject. So they bring about hyperobject. They bring about weirdness in things, the uncanny feelings of zones, the dreadful feeling that we're dissolving, like Neo, which we talked about in the first video. So in short, they bring about doom. They bring about death. To quote Morton, doom can mean fate, destiny, and in a strong sense, death. Finally, doom means justice, or even judge, one who dispenses justice. This destiny comes from beyond the human world and pronounces or decrees the end of the world. And so, in such paradigm, the hyperobjects bring justice to world. The decree is that everyone is a hypocrite now. And so denying it is just reinforcing the hypocrisy. And so that's what Morton calls the cynic. You know, the hypocrite, this is a quote, the hypocrite understands that she is caught in her own failure. The cynic still hopes that if he vomits disgustedly enough, things will change. The cynic hopes. He is not beyond hope. He is a hypocrite. He is trying to escape doom. And so hypocrites are somehow the most sincere people in a time of hyperobjects. What we are saying here isn't that you shouldn't be a hypocrite, okay? You can't, you cannot not be one when you're inside hyperobjects. And remember that you cannot escape from them. So the choice isn't really between being a hypocrite or not, but between being a cynical hypocrite or a sincere hypocrite, okay? A hypocrite that wants intimacy or a hypocrite after cynicism, after vomiting. So do you want to escape doom or be like, fuck it, in every sense of the word, maybe? So because what is a hypocrite? Well, Morton gives an etymological sense of hypocrisy. It comes from the ancient Greek. Hypocrisy is a compound word. It has the prefix hippo, which means under, hidden or secret, and the root krisis, which means judgment, discernment, determination, or doom. So hypocrisy means a secret or hidden judgment or a hidden doom. And so to quote, it is also simply hidden doom, a message sent from somewhere obscure, or a message that is secret in some sense, encrypted. And so in ancient Greece, the word was mainly meant to say delivery, like a hypocrite is someone who delivers something hidden, like an enigma for people who must figure out what it truly meant. So a hypocrite is someone who says something but means another thing, you know. So an actor is a hypocrite. But this also applies to language and speech itself as a whole concept. There is no such thing as a speech that is not hypocritical, because speech is a delivery, you know? I mean, think about it. Can words mean what they mean? Like, do they mean themselves or they mean other things? Other words that you need some convention to figure it out. If I just say chair, would you know what the word means unless we both agree that the word chair means the thing that we are currently sitting on, for example? And what about each word in the thing you're currently sitting on? You know, if you take this phrase, the thing that you are currently sitting on, what about each of those words? Don't you need also to know what each word means? So words never mean themselves, right? But they mean other words, which means you know, which mean other words, which also mean other words, which mean other words, etc., etc. You know, so words, every word delivers something different from itself. It says something, but it means something else. You know, so every form of speech is hypocritical. But then, so is the physical world. You know, the chair itself is a delivery. It is a phenomenon of the noumenal chair. You know, like you don't see the chair as it is, right? Now, again, that's kind of the matrix, you know, except that this time there is no escaping it. So no matter how many times you wake Neo up, he's still in the matrix. So you have a matrix within a matrix within a matrix within a matrix, you know, simulation within simulation within simulation. And so, to quote Morton, a thing delivers another thing. Rain, sunburn, plastic bag, and car engines all deliver the doom of the hyperobjects. They are its hypocrites. They lie about the hyperobjects. They tell secrets. But the secrets they tell actually tell us something about themselves, always in relation to others. You know, they deliver more about other things than about themselves. In no world, objects do things according to their own essences, as in, for example, Platonic or theological metaphysics. If so, we would only have to do one thing about just one thing. Like, for example, you wouldn't be able to talk about music, you just have to music about music, all right? But in reality, as Morton says, we clap about music, we dance about music, we play music about music, we write about music. All of these things are not the music about which we are performing. No object truly contacts another one. They really only share what Harman calls their notes. So architecture columns, or whatever it does, about human relationships. And dogs sniff about trees. Nicely, about can also mean around. And pencils, pencil about pencil sharpeners. So hence it is the notes, the phenomena, you know, the phenomena that matters, because the notes are what brings our attention to other things. You know, the lie isn't much of a lie. They lie about themselves to point at a truth about something else. All right. So the architecture tells something about human relations. Doesn't say anything about itself. You know, when you build a column, when you do architecture, you are talking about something else than the column, than architecture. Okay, so you can think about it like the liar paradox. You know, it's an old paradox from ancient Greece about Cretans. Cretans are people who are living on the island of Crete, and the story goes that a guy named Epimenides said that Cretans are all liars. The problem is, Epimenides is also Cretan. So this is a Cretan telling us that all Cretans are liars. And, and so he is saying that I am a liar too, you know, that I am lying. If I am a Cretan and all Cretans are liars, therefore I am also lying to you. And so this is a paradox, right? Because if you say you are lying, well, you're telling the truth. But you are indeed lying, and you're telling us what you are doing right now. So you're not telling the truth, you know. You get it? Like, if you are lying, which is what you are doing, then you are telling the truth. So it's it gets weird, right? When Morton tells us that with object-oriented ontology, that we are dealing with the same paradox. The sentence is a hypocrite. It says one thing, it does another. Objects are hypocrites, actors portraying themselves. And so, just like with acting, a good actor is someone who acts so well that you can no longer know if he is acting or not. You know, just like in the paradox. I mean, you know he is acting because he is an actor, but he acts so well that you don't know if it is true or not. And because of that, you cannot have the actor as a representation for the act. You know, like an actor who is good cannot be an actor, and he cannot be the thing that he acts, neither this or that. So they always point to some kind of truth that is radically other. You know, they can't be justly represented. They emit blue notes that differ from themselves without difference. They lie. Again, what constitutes pretense is that in the end you don't know whether it's pretense or not. Okay, again, like the paradox. the weather, so lies about the weather, but tells you a secret, a hidden truth about global warming that is unknown, that you have to decipher, that you cannot know for sure if it is about that or not. Okay, quote, why does the rain lie about the hyperobject while telling secrets about it? You know, because it cannot do otherwise. You know, it must always speak in secret, you know, and secrets that cannot be, that can't be shared either. You know, if someone discovers the truth, then we're talking about a meta-language here. You know, the secret itself must remain a secret that points to another secret, etc., etc., etc. In short, we see signs everywhere, but not the hyperobjects as such. We see signs of doom, but the doom is nowhere objectively present. And so if we can't see the hyperobjects, we can only see signs. Then how can we know that the signs are indeed those of the hyperobjects, right? So when I see when I say these are signs of hyperobjects, for example, I am lying, because in reality I am seeing signs that are signs of signs of signs, etc., 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 of hyperobjects. You know, there is an infinite number of signs between the sign that I am using and the hyperobject. You know. So in fact, the hyperobject never comes into this series. You know, there is an infinity between the two. It is a closed circle of signs, a hermeneutic circle, if you want, but this has also another implication, and that is the self doesn't exist in that circle. When you refer to yourself, saying me, for example, what are you referring to, if not other signs? Like, you know, with the word chair, right? So again, saying me is pointing to other signs that none of them are actually me, you know? So if I am stuck in the circle and the me, the I, isn't there, then I am both me and not me. The me is obviously in the circle since I am stuck there, but at the same time, the circle is all made of signs, and I am not a sign, so I cannot be there. So when I say this is me, I am both lying and telling the truth, but in a secret. You know, it's just a truth that we can't get at. You know, it has to stay a secret. So hyperobjects, they do the same. They're here, but their presence is concealed by their own manifestations, like my presence is concealed by all of the signs that ought to manifest it. Quote, the hyperobject is a liar. We never see the hyperobject directly. We infer it from graphs, instruments, tracks, in a diffusion cloud chamber, sunburn, radiation sickness, mutagenic effects, childbirth, etc. So since all of those signs lie about the hyperobject they refer to, because they're not referring to it, but to other signs, to other manifestations, we come to realize a scary thought, that there is no meta-language whatsoever, that nothing can refer directly to the hyperobject. We have no way to talk about or to point to global warming. To quote Morton, humans are forced to confront the phenomenological sincerity, the truth that there is no meta-language. Such a truth makes us extremely vulnerable, because, as he continues, we encounter the deep reason why inside the hyperobject we are always in the wrong. Since we never encounter the hyperobject directly, since we are lower dimensional than it and exist with it in an interobjective aesthetic causal space that includes 1 plus n withdrawn entities, we are unable to get a purchase on it. So there is no way out of this hypocrisy, of this beautiful soul syndrome, as he calls it. The belief that there is something beautiful beyond this, a realm in which there is no hypocrisy, a realm without, corruption, but a realm of pure beauty. As Morton points out, to get over beautiful soul syndrome is to realize that you are a hypocrite. It doesn't mean that you have to be a revolutionary in the Marxist tradition either, like it is the corporate world that is responsible for ecological disaster, so let's get rid of them and then boom, beautiful soul. Now, if you're a Marxist, this will sound like a misunderstanding of Marxism. As always, you know, anti-Marxist and non-Marxist will say that Marxism believes in utopian future, which all Marxists defend themselves from it. But here the problem isn't much about whether Marxism is a utopia or not. Rather, the problem is what policy to put forward. You know, is it more economic system or the individual that we should focus on? And so it's the prisoner's dilemma again. Should we disarm one or the other? Is there a guarantee that both parties will play along? And so, without getting into too much details about this, Morton says, according to many environmentalists and some anarchists, in denying that individuals have anything to do with why Exxon pumps billions of barrels of oil, Marxists are displacing the blame away from humans. This view sees the Marxist political response to the ecological emergency as hypocrisy. This is, of course, while the Marxists see the policies for ecological emergency also as a hypocrisy. Now, I am honestly prone to see the Marxist charge of hypocrisy more realist than the anti-Marxist charge. I think the corporate world's way of dealing with the crisis is more hypocritical than the Marxist policies, but the point is, no one is right when it comes to policies about global warming, whether you are a capitalist or a Marxist. Both Marxist and anti-Marxist just end up playing a game of who is less hypocrite by being the most cynical. To quote Morton, who grabs the most cynical meta position is the winner. Anything you can do, I can do meta. Going meta has been the intellectual gesture par excellence for 2 centuries. I am smarter than you because I see through you. Cynicism becomes the default mode of philosophy and of ideology. Unlike the poor fool, I am undeluded. Unlike the poor fool, I am undeluded. Either I truly believe that I have exited from delusion, exited from illusion, or I know that no one can, including myself, and I take pride in this disillusionment. So this is important. Knowing that you cannot have a meta language shouldn't be a reason for you to be proud and be like, at least I know we're doomed, I am better than others, you know. This is a stance that many postmodern cynics take, and if you do that, well, technically you are actually worse, you know, because not only you're a hypocrite, but you're what Morton calls a hypocritical hypocrite, and I don't think that achieving that level of hypocrisy should be anything to be proud of. That's just nihilism, which is not what Morton's philosophy or object-oriented ontology are about. Object-oriented ontology is again about intimacy, about connection, not about cynicism. Cynicism comes from a view that intimacy requires more than it actually does. It sets the bar way too high. That indeed no genuine feeling of intimacy is possible, you know. And so both the left and the right, for that matter, have a hyper-individualistic worldview, either by atomizing society or by making collectivism so difficult to attain that both sides fall into nihilism. What Morton says instead is that thinking needs to begin to set the bar incredibly low for solidarity between humans and between humans and non-humans, including non-sentient humans. Otherwise, we become gatekeepers of solidarity and remain within Nietzschean ontotheology, which is nihilism. And so this is where we turn to how we can keep that bar low to a realistic level of intimacy, and this is where art comes in. So art can do something amazing. Art is here to reveal something that we may have missed, and Morton argues that's why we have global warming in the first place. So what is this thing that we missed? Well, according to him, we've been given a choice between 2 options in philosophy regarding essences, regarding substances and things in themselves. We were told that either the essence of things is elsewhere in the deep structure of capital, the unconscious, atoms, evolution, the cosmic order, and so on, or two, there is no essence. The restriction of these choices between these two options is one reason why Earth is in big trouble. And so what we have missed was the third option, and that is that there is an essence, and it is right here in the object resplendent with its sensual qualities yet withdrawn. And so the point of art is to reveal to us this third option. That we miss. The reason why we have to rely on art here is because the first two options were the result of some sort of impotence to cope with the weirdness of objects. Okay, objects, because they're uncanny and do what everything we said they do so far, came with a challenge to our cognitive abilities. And hyperobjects only heighten this weirdness. The gap between thing and appearance keeps widening when we interact with hyperobjects. So, unable to explain this weirdness in the objects, we postulated that either their essence is somewhere else, or we just say that there is no essence. Otherwise, how can we explain, how can we account for the weirdness we encounter every day in objects? So to get a more graphic metaphor, it's like you're in Auschwitz, and the dreadful situation either makes you a believer in God. The essence isn't here. It cannot be in the death camp. It must be somewhere else, or to a metaphysical nihilism. There are no essences. But these two options are self-defeating, according to Morton, because they miss on the third option. The essence is in the labor camp, but both the guards and the prisoners missed it. And of course, it's better to miss it when you're the prisoner than the guard, because when you're the guard and you miss the essence, well, you get fascism. And even if you miss it just by a few. After all, that's the problem with Heidegger. Heidegger actually came very close to it, but he missed it too, and as a result he had a member card to the Nazi party. And so the impotence of grasping logically and with knowledge the essence of things brings us in what Morton calls the age of asymmetry, in which our cognitive powers become self-defeating. What he means by this is that what we were talking about earlier, that now no political decision or solution based on cognition or knowledge can work because they're all wrong, the asymmetry is between our thoughts and actions. The reflection to why you should save the kid from the truck is asymmetrical to the actual action of saving the kid. So in other words, the more we know about a situation, the less we know what to do about it. In the same way, the more we know about objects through science, the less we know what to do with them. What are they useful for? Objects become more rather than less strange the more that we get to know them. And so this, of course, goes against the belief of the Anthropocene that suggests that the more we know about something, the more we know what to do with it. Our knowledge and our actions in the humanist view are converging toward a certain point in which they would meet, like knowledge and action would meet, a point where action and knowledge would occur simultaneously without a medium. So imagine that you'd know what to do about something without even looking at it. When you watch a movie, for example, and there is a medical scene and the surgeon doesn't even have to look at the tools he's giving, like he doesn't even have the slightest, like he doesn't even have to take the slightest second to look at what he has in his hands. He has such a mastery over the surgery tools that he no longer needs the time, he no longer needs a medium to adjust his knowledge to the tool to commit the action. He already knows what the tool is and what it is for. Well, this is the kind of thing we're talking about here. You come to know things without the need to go through their appearance. And so this view brought what we call a theological history of art as expressed in Hegel. And Morton talks about Hegel. He writes, Hegel outlines a thoroughly teleological history of art in which increasing human understanding gives rise to a transcending of art materials, the aesthetic convention, the paint, the stone and ink, and eventually to a transcending of art itself. Hegel divides this history of art into three phases. So Hegel divides this history into three phases: the symbolic, the classical, and the romantic. And to go quickly through them, imagine that you are a human being and you start knowing about things. So that knowledge, you want to reproduce it somewhere, right? You want to visualize it, but at first your knowledge is very inadequate to the thing, right? It's like you want to know about, I don't know, about this phone, for example, and your knowledge isn't going to be direct but symbolic at first. Like I'm going to use symbols to understand this phone, where it came from, how was it made, and so those symbols are usually divine beings. You know, like you would go with God did it. You know, and I'm going to start to make drawings of gods instead of the phone. You know, I understand the natural world not as it really is, but as divine and manifest itself through inexplicable forces. Okay, I'm going to be drawing gods instead of just seas, for example. But as I continue to learn more, then eventually, because the symbolic stage is very unstable, I'm going to develop a more accurate knowledge about the phone. And now I'm going to paint the phone as I see it. You know, there are no gods anymore, no divine forces. I see the phone just as a phone. So we get to the classical phase, in which the representation of the phone, the painting, looks like the phone. So we're at the symmetry level here, okay? There is a symmetry. But Morton asks, Hegel asks, but are we? Remember that there is another phase in Hegel, which is the romantic phase. And so the equilibrium of the classical phase turns out to be unstable too, because we may have brought ourselves to the same level as the non-human object. Like, remember, in the symbolic stage, the world was pretty scary, right? Everything had some sort of divine presence, and there has to be gods involved in it, and gods were not known for their cool temper. And so human beings have been imagining all kinds of monsters, beasts, gods that can wreck their shit. And so their ignorance of the natural world made them very vulnerable. But thanks to rationality and thanks to science, they manage to level the field. You know, the problem was that fear from the symbolic phase. It didn't go away. You know, humans may have grasped a lot of things in the natural world, but they are still ignorant about something else. And that something else is, well, themselves, or more precisely, their own mind, their own spirits. If knowledge so far worked by representation, like I see something and I reproduce it on a canvas, the more my reproduction is close to it, the deeper and correct my knowledge is about it, right? But what if I'm trying to understand something that I cannot see, like my mind or my spirit? That's a different challenge, right? So what can reflect that mind so I can look at it and understand it? Well, nothing. In this case, nothing in my disposal, none of the materials that I have can allow me to know my own mind. So I have to transcend this, and I have to go beyond the classical phase. And so the romantic phase, well, that's where things get even messier. And this is where humanism starts to die. And so in this period, humans recognize, so in this phase, this period, according to Morton, humans recognize the infinite depth of their inner space for the first time. It becomes radically impossible to embody this inner space in any non-human entity. So romantic art must talk about the failure to embody the inner space in outer things. And so this is what Romanticism is about. You know, it's about the failure of projecting accurately your inner space, your mind, your spirits, your own emotions. Nothing can represent those, you know. And so this is why romantic arts are usually, you know, weird, and modern art is a direct consequence of that, like Impressionism, Surrealism, Expressionism, Futurism, Orphism, etc. All of those forms express this failure of spirit to grasp itself, to embody itself in outer things. Quote, "From here on, art can only be about the failure of its materials to embody spirit fully, precisely because spirit is not reducible to those materials. Art becomes deeply story-shaped as artists realize that since they can't directly express spirit, they must tell the story of the failure to express it." And so, in other words, I can't see myself anywhere, no matter where I look. Not a single thing reflects me. And so here art needs to recognize that philosophy is kind of its big brother. You know, artists have to become philosophers as well. You know, they must write. They must write manifestos and statements of purpose, philosophical explorations and justifications because of its failure. A quasi-philosophical statement of intent which decenters the art by providing a way to think about it, dislocated from experiencing it directly. So this means that when you look, for example, at a surrealist painting, you have no idea what you are looking at, or what you should be looking at. You have no idea about the intent of the painter, and surely knowing what the painter was intending with this can help you figure out what the hell you are actually looking at. And so, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to see actually when I look, for example, at a Rothko painting? If it is his emotions or his spirits, well, yeah, I'm going to need to know a little more about the guy's intentions, about his philosophy, his desires and secrets to make sense at what I have in front of my eyes. However, none of those will serve me because those are material. What's the difference between, you know, between looking at a surrealist painting and reading the Surrealist Manifesto? The manifesto is also paper on which there's ink. So what guarantees that I am seeing the painter's or / the philosopher's spirit when I read his writing or his biography more than I would from seeing his painting, for example? So the manifesto is also a surreal piece of art, and so art pieces are also signs that point to other signs, and none of them can do justice to the intent of the author or the artist. So another realization settles in. I do not matter. Like literally, there is no matter to serve my spirit. I am nowhere. The piano, for example, that I play isn't there to convey my emotions. If anything, I am here to convey the piano's emotions. You know, to quote Morton, what has happened so far during the epoch of the Anthropocene has been the gradual realization by humans that they are not running the show at the very moment of their most powerful technical mastery on a planetary scale. Humans are not the conductors of meaning, not the pianists of the real. Composers stopped listening to their inner space and started turning to the inner space of the piano, its physicality, its timbre. And so, in other words, now the point of art is not to convey an intent or an emotion, but to let the materials themselves be free and be themselves. We can't transcend them like Hegel hoped. We can only talk about our failure to do so, and by keeping failing, we come to realize that, well, it's the objects who are who are getting the best of it, who are beneficiating from all of this. And so since it is the only thing we can do, this is the only option available, and it is the most realistic one. And so speculatively, well, then artists have to look for ways to erase themselves from art. You know, when you play the piano, for example, the strings have to be about, you know, the piano, about the strings, but also about, you know, other objects, but not about the intent or the emotions of, you know, the composer. Quote, "This was also a moment of liberation for another physicality and non-human kind. Piano strings were beginning to be set free. Gradually, the inside of the piano freed itself from embodying the inner life of the human being and started to resonate with its own wooden hollowness." And so this is the third option that Morton was talking about. You know, it is the essence of the piano, the wood of the strings, that is, you know, resonating because we gave up on looking for the essence elsewhere. Remember that there is no elsewhere once you are in the hyperobject. So you are glued to that chair and your fingers are glued to the piano keys, period. And so you are the piano's instrument. The piano is the diamond and you move your fingers accordingly to it. Quote, "The pianist becomes the medium in the spiritualist sense for the piano." And so when you play the piano, you're being an instrument for the piano to do its own thing. And of course, the piano is not a piano without the rest of the objects who too want to resonate throughout the piano. Okay? So the piano is the instrument of other objects, which are the instruments of other objects, including the piano. And so other objects make the piano sound about other objects, etc., etc. And so Morton gives a series of examples here. Basically, the whole chapter is about artists who do this, who liberate, you know, the objects, who liberate the instruments. He goes into details about how each one created, you know, these effects. He takes the example of John Cage, and he gives. And John Cage, you know, he gives his piece liberated piano strings from sounding like a piano by placing other objects on them, domestic items that might surround pianos in normal circumstances, items such as rubber bands and screws. These objects, which created the prepared piano, were not meant to express John's inner self, Cage's inner self. They had their own anarchic autonomy. It is as if they were allowed to occupy the inner space of the piano. And so the piece the piece he's referring to by John Cage is called Sonatas and Interludes. And so these pieces create hyperobjects through the interconnectedness of all different objects that come together in the music. All right, and he gives another example, like for example, Lamonte Young's The Well-Turned Piano, a 5-hour-long piece with the goal to, quote, defy the human mind to make a story out of it. It is a loving work of restorative justice, allowing the piano to sound without reference to the human. And so you can say that this resembles a lot the symbolic phase, right? I mean, we're literally saying that objects are demonic, something that made some religious figure in the past to ban some notes because they come with some sort of uncanny feeling, right? Like basically there is basically the fear of demons in monotheistic religion is basically a fear of objects, that objects may take over, that humans have to get down a few ranks in an abstract hierarchy of beings. And so Morton gives the example of Pope Gregory, who developed rules for sacred music, banned the augmented fourth, the infamous the Diabolus in Musica. But other religions, more primitive in the sense of chronology, don't have this problem, being more animist than the monotheistic ones. Like for example, Hinduism. In Hinduism, the augmented fourth is considered sacred, quote, because it allows the ear to access a vast range of harmonics, a range that evokes a hugely expanded sense of what in musical language is called timbre. the material that generates a sound such as the wood and strings and open body of a sitar. So the age of asymmetry is kind of like that. It has an animalist features since materials now gain a new life. But this is not a return to primitivism. This is not a call to unlearn what we know. I mean, we're still scientists, and Morton has a passage in the previous chapter in Hypocrisies where he insists that hyperobjects don't reject science or anything, but on the contrary, their discovery is the discovery of modern physics is a consequence of object-oriented ontology. And so without quantum physics, without quarks and sine waves, there wouldn't be any hyper-object. So it's not a return to primitive religion or spirituality. We know that there are no spirits, and as he says, the age of asymmetry is not a return to animalism as such, but rather animalism and animalism sous rature, under erasure. It's like animalism in the sense that materials have life, but it's not animism in the sense that there are spirits giving life to objects. And so objects are still objects, and we're still going to the doctor instead of to the shaman when you are sick. Like we're still gonna read Richard Dawkins instead of Deepak Chopra. What is meant by the age of symmetry is that humans and non-humans face one another equally matched. The feeling is rather of the non-human out of control, withdrawn from total human access. We have even stopped calling non-humans materials. We know very well that they are not just materials for human production. We have stopped calling humans spirit. Sure, humans have infinite inner space, but so do non-humans. And we didn't give up on inner spaces either. It's important to note that we have not lost the sense of inner space. Of inner space. This feeling of inner space has only expanded since we now glimpse it in non-humans. Some even find it in other higher primates, some in all sentient beings, and some, the real weirdos such as myself, in all beings whatsoever. Eraser, black hole singularity, ceramic knife, molasses slug, etc. What is meant is that we're not talking about our own inner spaces, like Morton is not projecting his inner space on the eraser or the slug. Rather, he is saying that the eraser and the slug have an inner space just like mine. Okay, something that is always withdrawn even from myself. And so saying that the inner space, which is another term for essence at this point, is in some things, but not in others, that would be the first option. And saying that there is no inner space, that would be the second option. And Morton's third option is that everything has inner space that is hidden from themselves. So this supposes three things about the age of asymmetry. When everything has an inner space as deep as everything else, there are three features of this age, which are irony, weakness, and lameness. And so the age of symmetry is pretty ironic, because irony means that more than one thing is in the vicinity. Irony is the echo of a mysterious presence. For there to be irony, something must already be there. So this means that the inner space is always there, and it is always unknown. It's a mysterious presence, but as we said, that inner space contains all other objects, right? Or at least is about other objects. Everything is in everything, remember that. So this means that whenever you talk about something, whenever you draw something from the withdrawal uncanniness of the inner space, you're actually talking about something else that is still there, present in the uncanny. Like, you know how sarcasm works like that. You know, there is always something else. You can talk all you want about why you should, you know, save the boy, for example. The real reason of why you save the boy is always another. So, like Morton says, asymmetric irony is when we save the Earth, but we have no idea exactly why. So we know that what you say, what you put in front of people is never it, you know. And likewise, whatever people think you meant is not it either. So don't go thinking that this is an open gateway for intention trials, okay? If you constantly distrust someone's word because their intention is always hidden, but somehow you can manage to know what they're hiding, then you're just a hypocritical hypocrite, you know, you're just cynical. And so irony here is radical. Whenever you speak or listen, in both cases, it's ironic, okay? So don't go around making intention tries for people because you didn't get what irony means. So a good example of irony is that when some artists want to take credit for their work as proof of their genius, when an artist is like, I produced this masterpiece because I am so deep and I can see things that no one else would see, well, that's ironic. You know, it's ironic because he claims to see things no one sees, but he fails to see that he is, well, full of shit. Yeah. Like genius can no longer be a matter of being a genius like you are a genius, like a genius is a manifestation of your inner self. Instead, Morton says that genius is no longer a production of my inner space, but a collaboration between my inner space and at least one other entity. Art becomes a collaboration between humans and non-humans. And so genius is more like something that you have instead of something that you are, okay? And you have it through the collaboration with other objects. So it's like something that comes and goes depending on the structure you and the objects created. And so in this sense, you can never objectify an object. An object is precisely what cannot be objectified, cannot be reduced, because you cannot depend on it to show your genius. So a little bit of humility in this wouldn't hurt you. And so this brings us to the second characteristic, which is weakness. So of course, being this vulnerable and this dependent on the objects we used to dismiss, well, ironically, it makes us pretty weak, right? This is a realization that comes easy with global warming, and we see how fragile we are in front of, you know, the objects we created. Quote, "The time of hyperobjects is a time of weakness in which humans are tuned to entities that can destroy them." And so this is both to be understood as literally, like the radioactive stuff can literally destroy us, and also metaphysically, like our metaphysical conceptions of the human and the non-human, well, they kind of fall apart, you know. But it also means that we are cognitively weak. You know, that the more knowledge we have, the less we know, and the closer we get to the realization that when it comes to hyperobjects, we may never be able to know anything about them. And so for those who can't escape this weakness, they either deny it or you know, they either deny it altogether. Like, for example, tobacco companies will tell you that as long as you can't prove, really prove that cancer is caused by smoking, I don't need to believe that my product causes cancer, right? Or you can go to constructivism, which is basically wishful thinking in Morton's definition. The wish of constructivism is an if only. If only I could displace you enough, dear reader, the world would change. So if I can get to those politicians, if I can get those politicians to be sensitive about global warming, they'll surely do something about it, you know? So, like Morton reports, one of the solutions that happened when a judge named Nicolas Zambrano in 2015 had to make a decision about, you know, an oil spill in Ecuador, and the responsible is a company named Chevron, but Chevron kept postponing the verdict by demanding more and more research because nothing points to to that the oil slip is what causes, the danger. So they were wasting time trying to prove that the spill was harmful to the environment. And none of the proofs were conclusive, according to Chevron, because you can always, say, well, this doesn't really prove or stuff like that. And so the judge, Zombrano, opted for another strategy. Instead of looking for proofs that the oil is harmful, he suggested that we try to look for proofs that the oil is not harmful. And so his argument was, we can't know which one is true, but in one case there is no harm, but if the other is true, if there is harm, then the damage can be critical. So we are going to take, are we going to take the risk? Well, no. So the oil has to be removed until Chevron brings the proof that it's not causing harm. In other words, to quote Morton, the best action is to act as if the threat were real. Precisely because the hyperobject is withdrawn, it is mathematizable to humans as rems and rems of data, its appearance is in doubt. And for precisely this reason, precaution must be the guiding principle. No further proof is required since the search for proof is already contaminated by an unwillingness to acknowledge the hyperobject. An unwillingness we may readily call denial. The burden of proof is therefore shifted to the defendant. Chevron must now prove that oil does not have a harmful effect. So the weakness in the Age of Symmetry urges us to act without looking for reasons. So you save the kid even if you cannot prove that the truck, wasn't going to kill him. You don't need reasons. Reasons inhibit our responsible action or seriously delay it. And so these are the things that you find in a political agenda. For example, if you want to take care of the ocean, for example, if you want to deal with global warming, the last thing that you need are reasons, And so art then, to go back to it, shouldn't be about thinking. It should be about action. Quote, we need art that does not make people think. We have quite enough environmental art that does that, but rather that walks them through an inner space that is hard to traverse. This resonance contains a vital ecological truth because the object-oriented art of the Age of Asymmetry forces us to coexist with non-humans, coexist without an agenda. So political agendas are just delay. If a party has an agenda, then they're going to privilege their own reasons, their own agendas over global warming or over sexism, over racism, the interest of the working class. But the problem is, well, you can't really deal with any of those if you take them separately, hence the need to deconstruct the human. When humans and non-humans are forced to coexist, then we have more action and less agendas. Then you can make everything work together. This comes at a price, but it's a price worth paying. And so this price is the third characteristic of the age, which is lameness. And so in lameness, we realize that, we as well as everything else are lame. Since both humans and non-humans have to coexist, then they're both lame. Right? Like reality is lame because, it has ghosts. Ghosts aren't like some simulacra that is hiding from us a real reality, but it is part of reality as well. Quote, ecological coexistence is with ghosts, strangers and specters precisely because of reality, not in spite of it. The coexistence of beings without an agenda is predicated on what I call lameness. Lameness is the third human attunement to the time of hyperobjects, the first two being hypocrisy and weakness. So ghosts are often portrayed as not belonging to reality, right? That there is something weird about them, that they don't fit in there. Reality is the space of the living who thrive over non-life. The ghosts, the in-between, has no business here. We often say that, a ghost is an unfinished business, like they have to go away, there's something wrong with them. But then everything is a ghost. since their appearances do not coincide with their essences, right? Like appearances have no business here. Like this is reality. Well, too bad, reality is lame. You know, reality is a coexistence between these two that shouldn't be together, apparently. So yes, it is inconsistent for a ghost to linger in the world of the living, but it is part of reality. You know, you can either bitch about it or accept that reality is inconsistent. It is lame. And so to quote Morton, an object fails to coincide with its appearance for another object, no matter how accurate that appearance for. There is thus a lameness within every object, a lameness that constitutes the very being of the object as such. In order to exist, an object must fail to coincide with itself totally. Existence is not consistency, but rather a fragile inconsistency. So, hyperobjects basically have this effect. They make the lameness of reality the more apparent by withdrawing even more its essence. So this means that the further we are from the essence, the more withdrawn it is from us. Like the lamer, the weaker, and the more ironic we are, and that weird turn in a weird turn in a twist happens to be the closest you'll ever get to reality. You know, that weird turn, that weird twist that you like when you watch a movie and there's always a twist, and sometimes the movie just gets weird. Well, and sometimes it gets lame, the plot gets weaker, and it gets a little bit ironic. Well, that's reality, actually. So the further you are from reality's essence, the closer you are to reality. And so hyperobjects, they throw us into reality by taking away from its essence, by taking us away from its essence. They do it through their five aspects. Remember them: viscosity, non-locality, temporal undulation, phasing, and interobjectivity. And each one of these, like the diamond, gets inside and attunes itself to us, which then we, by being in the hyperobjects, attune to the biosphere, to the atmosphere, etc. We reach what Morton calls rest. And so rest basically means thinking, but in a contemplative way. You know, like when you meditate. This is not the type of thinking in which you look for reasons to act, but this is the type of thinking in which thinking is the action, and in which thinking is an attunement to the hyperobject. Quote, rest could be an attunement to the non-human, coexisting with their spectrality. Thinking is already in itself a relation to the non-human insofar as the logical content of one's thought is independent of the mind thinking it. In this sense, thinking is intrinsically contemplative. Thus, when in meditation the mind takes itself as its own object of rest, the withdrawn secret quality of the mind itself becomes poignant. So when Morton writes this book, when Morton writes his this book, when he contemplates hyperobjects, he is attuning himself to the hyperobjects, and the hyperobjects then is attuning itself to him. Like now we have to live in harmony with global warming. Whatever it is that we do, global warming is not going anywhere, but it's going to stay for 1,000 years at least. But this by no means is an apolitical thought, or a resigning from action or looking for solutions. Rather, with rest, we become more familiar with global warming and more intimate with it, despite the fact that the more we attune to it, the stranger it becomes. But that is how it is, you know, apprehending global warming through its weirdness seems to be the only available option we have. So we can't rely on correlationism anymore. Remember that word, it's the subject-oriented relationship. We need the speculative realist approach, the one that needs resting and imagination as well as science and data and facts. So speculative realism is about poetry, it's about philosophy, history, physics, biology, sociology. All of those things ought to work together in a contemplative manner, in a meditative and resting action. And so resting is here to be taken as Yue, you know, the Taoist philosophy of inaction, of inactive action, sorry, as opposed to the active looking for reason to act action, let's say. So like toning it down a little bit, you know, wouldn't be bad. After all, we are the most uncanny thing among things. You know, we are the uncanniest thing among things because, as Morton writes, what makes humans the most dreadful is their ecological power. The uncanniness of human being is that it stirs up the oceans, divides the rocks, and plows up the soil. So maybe we should chill a little bit, you know, like take hyperobjects as they are and learn what they tell us about ourselves and about objects. Hyperobjects are, we can think of them as aliens that brought us some sort of, you know, radical technology to which we definitely were not prepared, but now they're here. You know, their technology is also here, so we better go with it. You know, as Morton concludes his book, the reality is that hyperobjects were already here, and slowly but surely we understood what they were already saying. They contacted us. Hyperobjects profoundly change how we think about any object. In a strange way, every object is a hyperobject. But we can only think this thought in light of the ecological emergency inside of which we have now woken up. Heidegger said that only a God can save us now, as we find ourselves waking up within a series of gigantic objects. We realize that he forgot to add, we just don't know what sort of God. And so that's it. We finished the book. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this book and gave you reasons to go check Morton's other works, as well as Harman's object-oriented ontology. Tell me what you thought of his philosophy in the comment section, and I